Okay, so I'm going to ask right away. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
My voice is really rough. I've been babying it all morning so that I can talk for the next couple hours with you all. Hopefully you will have opportunities to talk as well. But if at any time you can't hear me, please let me know. We're also, as always, dealing with internet stuff. I'm located up on Washington Island in Door County, and I have 2 network providers just in case. It's a little bit windy up here today, so one of them might not be great. So if I suddenly pop off, pop back on, you know why. It's because I'm just switching providers real quick. So I'm Deb Wisniewski, and up on Washington Island in Door County. And the funny thing is, just for random bits of knowledge about me, my last name actually comes from a Polish word that means cherries. So it seems pretty appropriate I live in Door County. I know, right? And I want to kick us off by just acknowledging the traditional residents of the land, wherever we all live. The people of this island, there were quite a different number of groups that lived here, the native people here. Best known and sort of longest lasting were members of the Potawatomi Nation. So as we start to engage in conversation with each other, I just want to start with an acknowledgement of the indigenous people wherever we are. And I want to recognize their continuing connection to the land, the waters, and the culture, and pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. So I am going to start sharing my screen. All right, that should work. As I mentioned, my name is Deb, and I'm a consultant, and the name of my consulting business is Sharing Common Ground. But I'm also a steward with the ABCD Institute, which is in partnership with and located at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. I've lived in Door County for about full-time for about 4 years, but we've had connections to Washington Island for over 17 years. So I've known the people here for a long time. Spent most of my time adult life in Madison. So I'm a Wisconsin girl at heart. And I noticed just when you guys were logging on that some of you know each other and some of you may not, or you may not know each other very well. But we're going to do things a little different in terms of introductions this morning. And just a moment, Natalie is going to put you in groups of 2. And instead of introducing yourselves during the introduction, we're going to ask you to introduce yourself, introduce your community to your partner. I'm not going to give you any guidelines on how to do that, what high points to hit, or what key things you should share about your community. It's really up to you. And you'll have a total of about 6 minutes altogether. Each person will have 3 minutes to talk to the other person, and we'll shoot you a message about halfway through. So Natalie, if you could have groups of 2 for a total of 6 minutes, that would be great. All right, so Rolf was just sharing how he loved that process. Rolf, why don't you tell us what you like so much about it?
Well, first of all, it didn't turn into a biography. Who I am, what I do, what I've done, what I hope to do, what I aspire to. Instead, it made me take a step back and say, where do I live? Who are my neighbors? What do we have in common? What's the history, et cetera, et cetera. So it immediately made me, in a positive way, kind of look through a different lens. So that's the first thing I liked about it.
Great. How about other folks? Anything strike you either about that idea of introducing your community or what you learned about the other person's community?
Well, Deb, this is Tom. I'll just say generically that I'll build off of Rolf's comments. I love that process too, because I think for me, so I was in the same room as Bob, and we know each other well, and we know of each other what we're, our different groups are working on. And of course, organizationally, where we connect with Bob and FRP, but it builds, I think, a genuine sense, an authentic sense of humanity. I mean, we spent probably a minute or two talking about children's artwork, and it was just a connective thread. And I think the value on that, the symbolism that for me is, this Saturday in Port Washington, we're leading our Love Our Great Lakes Day event. LNRP is helping to lead that as one of our partner groups, Ozaki County Watershed Coalition. And the focus thematically is on water policy, and it's in an election year cycle. And I was just telling the newspaper here this morning, the value of building opportunities for constructive community engagement, for constructive conversation, to really kind of find that common human thread and the value add for the work that we're doing. And of course, that means looking at each other, like Rolf was just saying, through a different lens sometimes. And so it was just really cool to sort of come on with Bob and spend a few minutes kind of being human before we even got to the work that we share. So that was neat.
Mhm. Mhm. Any other thoughts from anyone else?
I shared our session with Kendra, and Kendra actually lives in Madison, but identified her community as the Great Lakes community, which is just an interesting way of kind of putting that community in context with what the discussion is today.
Mhm. Did
Kendra, I
anybody
put you on
learn
the spot.
something? That's right. Did anybody learn anything about the other person's community that they didn't know, or surprised them, or they found particularly interesting?
I certainly learned from Donna that Sheboygan is a much more diverse community than I imagined it was. And I think we also shared that one of the values we need to have in doing the work we do is persistence, because there are setbacks as well as successes that we deal with. But both a small community like Algoma and Sheboygan are rapidly changing, and just being aware of that and what it means to our organizations.
All right, any last comments before we move on?
Would you repeat that?
Any last comments before we move on?
Oh, I'd just like to make one. I spoke with Jess Lutzy, and he's with the Climate Change Coalition of Door County. And instantly we had a connection made, because he is highly involved in climate change, education, and tree and compost saving. And it's the same thing that I have come from in the background of Trout Unlimited and the Friends of Stony Brook. We're both restoring part of this earth that has been violated. And also it's just another scary thing about looking into the future with climate change and what we're doing and how it will affect our resources.
Thanks, Joseph. All right, we're going to jump back onto the PowerPoint here. Let me just find that quick. All right, I want you to keep in mind some of the things you heard about the other community, as well as keeping in mind what you chose to share about your own community, right? There's a lot of different things that can be shared when you talk about your own community. So just keep those things in mind as we move forward through the next hour and a half or so together. So today we're going to be talking about what is ABCD. So it's a asset-based community development. You'll be getting a basic introduction to the principles and practices, and you'll be able to start reflecting about how you can think about diversity, equity, inclusion, justice from an asset perspective. We're going to be holding an in-person part 2 of this, which will be a deeper dive into some of the tools and strategies. And Natalie has shared some of that info with you already, and we can share it with you again after today's workshop in case you didn't have it or weren't sure if you could sign up yet or not. So I always like to have certain agreements when I gather people together for for a workshop. I want to stress that this is a learning community first and foremost. So whatever, the whole point here is to learn not only about the content, but from each other, about ourselves, about the way we think about things. It's very participatory, so I encourage you to be present. Do your best not to be multitasking. I personally don't believe there is such a thing as multitasking because I equal that to no tasking because you don't get anything really done. So I encourage you to be present. It's also a safe place if you don't want to respond, or I always say you can pass or play. We each speak for ourselves and take care of ourselves. I've got a very quick break in the middle, but anytime you need a break, you can put your video on pause, step away, take care of yourself. Is there anything else anybody feels like we should include here?
Deb, just real quick, on your last slide, I think you had October 27th, and I think it's October 25th, is it not?
I could have lied. That's always a
Just so
possibility.
nobody
Yeah,
writes
man,
that
you're
date
right.
down.
It's on my calendar too. It's the 25th.
Same, yep.
Oh, see, I was just checking to see if you guys were paying attention.
I just didn't want anybody to show
Thank
up on
you,
the
Jim.
27th.
You are absolutely right. It's on Tuesday, the 25th. That was a typo on my part. Thank you so much.
And honestly, that was a really great example of living out all these agreements. We're learning, we're all present, we're listening. It's a safe place for saying anything and being corrected. So that was great, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you both, Jim and Jeff. The one other responsibility that I like you to consider is the fact that you are the person that's in charge of your own learning. Okay, so if you don't understand something, I'm going to share some information with you. I generally call this first workshop the vocabulary lesson because it has some of the nuts and bolts of ABCD, but it's really up to you to think, how does this apply in your context, given the work that you do, either within your job, in your community, as a volunteer, as a paid person, whatever your context is. All right. And I'm going to stop sharing here for just a second. And I'm going to start a poll really quick here. So we're going to start out with a real quick poll because we keep talking about this thing called ABCD, or asset-based community development. So there's going to be a poll popping up on your screen, and it should be up. You can choose as many answers as apply to you. How familiar are you with ABCD? All right, I'll just give it another second. Looks like most people have responded. I'm going to end that poll. Let you see. So this is great because some people think it's just part of the alphabet, and some people maybe have vaguely heard about it, but no specific training or anything. So thanks for answering that. That's very helpful. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen here then. All right, let me close that again too. Here we go. Okay. So this is not a great graphic, but imagine this is a cup that's halfway filled with liquid. Now, if I were to ask you to describe, that the contents of that cup, in relation to the cup, you might say it's half full or half empty, right? It's a real basic representation of what we're talking about when we talk about ABCD. because you can think about that cup as either, you know, in terms of communities, the people that live in communities. So you could really focus on what, just a moment, I'm gonna ask people to mute. I think we need to mute because I hear some background sound. Maybe I'll just mute you. There we go. All right, I think we got you all muted now. But anyway, you can describe communities in terms of the deficiencies and needs of the community, or the half empty part, or you could really focus on, you know, what's the half full part of communities, you know, the skills and talents of community members, and the strengths of communities. When we describe people in terms of needs, now some of you may have like had to do needs maps of a community or of a neighborhood. And when you do that, you get people really broken up. You know, we look at a map in terms of what's wrong with it, right? And, you know, we look at their problems: gangs, child abuse, graffiti, crime, dropouts, you know. And if we look at a community, first of all, let me just ask the question, and you can answer this either in chat, or you can, we're a pretty small group, so you can also just say what you think. But what communities often are described in terms of their deficits? What kinds of communities are typically described in terms of their deficits? I'll stop sharing for just a second so I can see the chat better.
Well, I'll throw one out. We often talk about minority communities and look at the needs more than what they're bringing to the table, you know. So I think that's one kind of stereotypical way that where we look at that half empty scenario.
Yep, exactly. And you know, there's lots of great answers in the chat too. Vulnerable communities, poor communities, low income. One of my favorites, at-risk youth, right? Does anybody here know one youth that puts their hand up when you say, who's at risk? Kids don't describe themselves that way. Why do we describe them that way? You know? So, you know, a lot of communities are described in terms of their deficits. I'm going to go back and I'm gonna also ask. I lost too many screens open here sometimes. There you go.
Well, while you're doing that, Deb, can I just add to kind of building off of Rolf's point? I mean, I think that's such an important context for LNRP as we move forward with DEI efforts and with really engagement at the local community level, 2023 and beyond, the collaboration that we have with our local community partners, our watershed groups. I think so often the temptation is for us to sort of approach a community through the lens of what we think they need. And of course, kind of as Rolf was saying, instead coming with an authentic approach on what do you need and how can we help?
Yeah, and we'll be diving exactly into that a lot more as we move forward, dear Tom. You know, because we do, you know, often I call ourselves chronic caretakers or chronic do-gooders, you know, in our desire to help people. We relegate people to being needy, right? We see them as having all these problems like we see in this needs map. When we start telling people or identifying communities in terms of what's wrong, what happens to the people in that community? What happens to that community? Feel free again to either jump in the chat or just speak up. What happens when we identify people in terms of what's wrong with them or what we think their needs are? They become more marginalized. They believe it's true about themselves, right? They get identified that way. Victimhood, position ourselves above them. That's a really good one too, right? So they feel disempowered, feel down about their community, right? They start believing this stuff is true. That's how we're identified. So we came up with a list as well, which includes a lot of the ones that you all have. They believe we're deficient. It fragments efforts to find solutions, right? I always say, we've got the programs for, kids who aren't graduating from high school. We've got the programs for people who are unemployed. We've got the programs for single pregnant women, right? But what about the single pregnant teens that are unemployed? They kind of cross all these things. So do we stick them in like 3 different programs? Do we have 3 different programs going after those same group of kids? It targets resources to service providers. So often, there's money for all these outside providers, but people in that community aren't benefiting really from, the financial resources in particular. It makes leaders in the community denigrate their own communities through funding. So, people who are leaders are trying to find grant money, and they have to tell you how bad things are in their community in order to get that grant money, And then let's say they get that money because they told you how bad it is. Then they have to go and they have to tell you, if they get that grant, they have to continue to tell you that we're doing a really great job, but it's still really horrible. And they learn to rely on that outside money, right, in order to keep doing those programs. It also really emphasizes relationships outside of the community. Who are the funders outside of the community that can come in and help us? And there's that sense of hopelessness. A lot of people feel disempowered and hopeless. So it makes us think exactly what is asset-based community development. So it's really the complete opposite. And I think you'll find it really is not, I always like to say it really is not rocket science. ABCD was, I like to say it was discovered and named by 2 guys. They did not invent it. John McKnight and Jody Kretzman, who had traveled all over the United States, originally in urban areas, but now this broadened beyond the United States, all over the world. In fact, last year we just had an international online conference. And it's also rural, everything rural, suburban, urban, everywhere, every type of community. But they went around at the time, was back in the probably late 80s, but early 90s, real early 90s, and just talked to people in communities. Said, tell us about a time that your community worked really well together. Tell us about a high point in your community. And these were like the communities that had all those labels, those poor communities, troubled communities, bad neighborhoods. We've all heard that term. Don't go there, that's a bad neighborhood. And they were so excited to hear these stories because the local people were like, nobody ever asked us this. And they shared these great stories and talked about what they drew upon, the assets of their communities. And John and Jody took all this information and really helped to come up with what they were observing, words to help describe this. And they came up with this idea of asset-based community development, or ABCD. So we really, before I forget, not only are we recording this, we are also going to send you the PowerPoint afterwards. So if you're frantically trying to take notes, you don't have to worry about that. So anyway, for ABCD, it really, we're going to talk more specifically about the assets, what we're talking about as assets. But some of the key things is it really starts with the skills of local residents. Because every community has residents and every individual has gifts and talents. And it also looks at the power of local associations. And that's those informal networks of relationships between people. And we also look at the local institutions. And those are, some of the key strengths in a community. And we look at how do you build on those strengths in order to make that community stronger and more sustainable. I always like to reinforce, this is not a new thing that you have to suddenly add on to your workload. One of the key things about ABCD is it's first and foremost a lens. It's really stopping and thinking, how do I see people? How do I see the communities I work with? How do I see the people that care about the things that I care about? In your cases, thinking about the water and the land and nature. I know this is a group that really cares about that stuff. And, people in all communities there's people in all communities that care about this stuff and would like to do something about this. So how do we look at our communities in a way that really recognizes every individual there as someone with gifts and talents, and every community with assets? I also like to describe this as an art. It's going to look different in every location. It's not like I'm going to give you a list of steps 1 through 10. This, I really even hesitate to call it a model, quote unquote, because it doesn't have, we have associated tools and strategies, which we'll get into more next time, although we'll start introducing some of those this time. But it really is about trying to pull together the best of your community. And there's tools and strategies you can use, but we also borrow liberally from other strength-based approaches as well. So I'm going to start by talking about the 3 characteristics of ABCD. The first is obviously its name, it's asset-based. The first book that was written by John and Jody was called Building Communities from the Inside Out. And, that title really embodies this whole, all 3 of these characteristics, if you will. So we start with assets. What is present already in that community? All right, we'll be talking about the assets a lot more. Internally focused. So again, as you all pointed out earlier, I think Walt was saying this, Tom was saying this, we don't start with people coming from outside the community and saying, pointing fingers, either literally or figuratively, and saying, you people need to do X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank. Anytime that phrase, you people, pops into your head or you hear it out of somebody else's mouth, you're coming from the outside and pointing at people on the inside and telling them what you people need to do. So part of this is discovering what people who live in that community really care about and what they want to work on and their problem solving capabilities. For the next point, I always like to say that in terms of, they always say in real estate, the 3 most important words are location, location, location. And I always say in terms of community building, the 3 most important words are relationships, relationships, relationships. To me, that should be like the bedrock of communities, is thinking about the relationships. And we're constantly looking for where the relationships are, how we can strengthen those, how we can build those, how we can build on the relationships that are there. And all of this for me, boils down to, are we strengthening those natural community relationships and networks, or are we replacing them? Are we trying to put things in place of what those relationships are? Or in some cases, we're just getting in the way of relationships. And again, in the name of doing good. I've done a lot of work with systems that affect people who have disabilities. And I remember working at the university a while back, and we had a young man who worked in our office who had a job coach. Now, if you're not familiar with a job coach, it's someone who helps a person who may have certain disabilities be able to learn their job and perform at their job. Well, I wanted this young man, his name was Arthur. I wanted to ask Arthur to do a task for me. We had a task for him. He was a very capable young man. And this job coach, in her best well-meaning do-gooder role, literally jumped between me and Arthur, put herself physically between us with a big smile on her face and said, "What do you want Arthur to do?" And I said, "Well, first I want you to get out of the way so I could talk to Arthur." Now think to yourself, in the communities that you work in or work with, about some of the systems that sometimes get in the way of people being able to do the good work in their communities. So I'm just going to leave that rhetorically out there for now, but think about that as we go forward with our conversations today. But I want to say, so where do we start with this ABCD stuff? Well, we start with the obvious stuff. We start with the assets. Excuse me, I take a sip of my tea here. We're going to start with the assets. Now, when John and Jody did their tour of the United States and met with literally thousands of communities and thought about and compiled this data and really, explored what were they learning, they decided that there were certain assets that were present in every community. So these assets are everywhere. And I'll mention that the top 5 were the ones they initially identified. And then later people realized that the 6th one was missing. And so today we're going to be going through these 6 assets. And the top 3 we'll spend the most time on, but we'll also be touching on the other 6. All right. So I'm going to jump in with and I'm also going to mention that I'm going to cover these in this order because we often, when people do think about community assets, I'll tell you the truth, the one thing, if they don't know about ABCD, and if you said, what does your community have to offer people? Most likely people will jump to number 3, which are the local institutions, the service systems, the organizations, the things that might be in a resource directory, if you will. Or you might be able to call United Way and ask United Way about. I can almost bet that United Way does not have, and this is nothing against United Way, please. I love United Way. I've done lots of work with United Way. But United Ways don't have those other assets documented in their communities. And they are equally, if not more important than the institutions. The institutions are the most obvious. But we're going to go through these together. We're going to start with individuals. And I'm going to tell you 2 stories. I'm going to tell you first about an individual who was born February 1st, 1996. This person was labeled at risk from the time she was born. She had special ed programming throughout elementary and high school. She was diagnosed with a hearing loss, ADHD, the inattentive type, executive functioning disorder, anxiety, depression along the way, and probably the most severe math disability I've ever seen. She also has some physical medical issues that she deals with. She's low income and she's moved to a new community where she doesn't know anybody. That's my first story. So my second story is about a young woman named Claire. She's 26 years old. She has a degree from a small liberal arts college with a major in creative writing, specifically poetry. She has 2 minors, one in environmental studies and one in a combination of anthropology and sociology. She plays guitar and ukulele, loves to sing. She is really creative. She's passionate about social justice and connecting kids to their natural environment. In fact, she's been called a kid whisperer. And she's currently working for the Kentucky Science Center, which is the state designated science museum kind of place, as an educator, helping to run programs for kids that are coming and visiting the place. It's kind of like a kids museum, except for all ages, a hands-on kind of science museum. So you may suspect here that these are 2 stories about the same person. And this person happens to be my daughter, who gives me permission to share her story. In fact, I have permission to share stories of all the people that I use in the workshop, just so you know. And life can be really challenging for Claire, but she also is an extremely gifted and talented person. And if you were to talk to her, she would say she doesn't want you to ignore the fact that she has all these other challenges, but she also doesn't want to be identified by those. She wants to be able to do the work in her community. She wants to be able to work with kids and share her gifts. And, with an ABCD perspective, we see that everyone has something to offer. And we especially look to include people who are traditionally excluded. Those populations that we talked about earlier that are seen as needy or as deficient or at risk. Whenever we look at success stories in communities, individuals, the gifts of an individual, there's always an individual or one or more individuals who are involved in that success story. And it's their assets that are contributing to that success story. So behind every success story in any community, there is one or more individuals who are sharing their gift, who are driving that story. So keep that in mind. This is probably both the most important asset and the most overlooked asset. And so when we talk about this one too, the other thing to keep in mind is we're not just talking about people who are in professional roles sharing their gifts. So yes, the mayor is really important, or the police chief might be really important, or the teachers might be really important. But so are the kids, the youth in that community. You know, so are the moms that are hanging out, you know, with their kids at PTA meetings or at the playground. So are, you know, the older adults in the community that are retired, but that are, you know, connecting with people in the community. So we really want to keep this one in mind. This is a really strong one. So one of the things we want to do when we recognize that individuals are so important to our community is we want to discover what their gifts are. We want to find out what matters to them. And we have an exercise that we do. There's a lot of ways of doing this. I want to say this. And we're just going to touch on one way today, but we're going to talk about more next when we meet next, for those of you who are able to come next time. This time we're going to talk about something we call the 4-H's. And in just a couple of minutes, we're going to be putting you guys in groups to share and talk about your gift. But I want to review what the 4-H's are. So I'll go through these one by one. And this is not 4-H like, I know my daughter was in 4-H. This is a different kind of 4-H, just so you know. But you might see some similarities. So there's gifts of the hands. That's the first 4-H, right? What can I do with my hands that I like to share with others? Do I bake? Can I shovel snow? Do I garden? Do I play sports, change oil in cars, work on cars? You know, anything I can do with my hands. Gifts of the head. This is something I know about and I like talking about. We all know that there are the sports fanatics, right? Like my mom, she knows her Brewers and she can tell you about all the players on the Brewers. She can tell you who's out, you know, injured, what they got to do to get into playoffs. She can tell you their record. She knows all that stuff. All right. So, you know, it's anything that you know about that you like sharing or teaching other people about. Maybe you know a lot about computers, you know, whatever it is you know about. This is gifts of the heart, and this is going to resonate with a lot of you. These are things that you are passionate about enough that you're willing to do something about it, you know, and a really good example is people who are passionate about the environment. You know, they are willing to do something about that. And then we have gifts of human connections. Now, I always say there's two kinds of gifts here within this bucket of human connections. First, there's people, again, like my mom. I should mention, my mom loves when I talk about her at workshops. Sometimes she'll even get on workshops with me. She's 84 years old and she's hilarious. And she knows everybody. And this is her gift, it's her human connection. And if she doesn't know, you know, if she meets you and she says she goes through this little Rolodex in her brain for people who are old enough to remember Rolodexes, or spreadsheet, if you want to think spreadsheet. And she thinks, who do I need to connect you with? Who do you need to get to meet? Or who do we already have in common? She's that kind of person. And we know people like that, that person that can't help connecting people, right? Then there are the other kind of people that you just like to be with, like their presence, their connection. They really connect with you on a human level. It's like when my best friend comes over to my house and I don't care what my house looks like. And I know we're going to laugh, we might cry, but we're just together, right? And there's that one-to-one human connection and she has that gift of connecting with me. And that could be true in so many people. Again, I had a friend whose daughter had significant labels of disability. She had all the negative labels you could think of. She was nonverbal. She was non-ambulatory. She was, you know, she couldn't She used a wheelchair, but she couldn't use it independently. She was, she was dependent on everyone else. She couldn't feed herself, all this stuff. But my friend was really committed to her being present in some of the regular classrooms in her school. So she was in band class because she loved music. And my friend went to her band class one day and asked a really scary question for a parent. He said, does anybody here consider yourself to be a friend, consider my daughter to be your friend? And there were several girls that raised their hand. And he asked, why? Why do you think of my daughter as your friend? And the girl said, because she keeps secrets better than anybody I know. Well, she couldn't talk. It was hard to know what she was thinking. But that girl didn't see that. She saw that as a gift, that she could tell my friend's daughter anything. She could tell her about, the issues with drugs in the school, or having a fight with her parents, or a boyfriend that was pressuring her to do things she didn't want to do, or she could just tell her anything, how she was scared to go to college, whatever. And she knew that she could be herself with my friend's daughter. So it really is, this idea of how do we think of people's gifts? And sometimes that a thing we think of as a deficit is actually a gift to someone else, depending on how that gift is, there's opportunities for that person to share that gift. Okay, so you might want to just jot down hands, head, heart, and human connections if you haven't. I'm going to stop sharing here in just a second, but I want to give you a chance to keep those in mind. And you're going to have a partner, you're going to have 6 minutes. And I want you to pick at least 2 of these for each of you to introduce yourself to the other person. And again, each of you will have 3 minutes, and I want you to switch after 3 minutes. And, really challenge yourself to think about this. If you just like being around people, don't say human connection, because that's not necessarily what we're getting at. But if you're an active connector, like you really like connecting people with each other, you can talk about that one. If you're really passionate about something, talk about how you show that passion, how you share that gift. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing. So anyway, so these are institutions, local institutions. And I'm going to ask the same question that I asked about associations. So what are the assets of institutions? What can they offer to a community besides the services they're designed to deliver? So we're going to use libraries as an example. And I'll stop sharing the slides so we can see each other a little bit here. If we're thinking about libraries, we think of the obvious stuff. But what else can libraries offer to community besides the fact that they have books to lend out, or movies to lend out, or audiobooks or whatever? What else can libraries offer to a community besides the stuff we typically think of?
They certainly offer the opportunity to socialize, and also connect people with maybe support they need within the community.
They really do. I mean, it's amazing the way that I just got done working for about 4.5 years with libraries and museums across the country on a special ABCD project. And it's amazing the types of services that are offered through libraries these days to help people get support. But it's also what I would call, what we call a bumping place in a community, or a third place. It's a place where people can go. That's the first 2 places are usually home and work, or home and school for a person. And a library is an example of a bumping place, or a third place where people can go and bump into each other and socialize and make those neighborhood connections, right? So that's great. What else can libraries offer to a community? Mary.
Sheboygan's library is a wonderful, but and I'm sure a lot of them offer meeting rooms so that organizations can have regular meetings or events. But right before COVID hit, our library purchased about 35 ukuleles that they checked out for a month at a time. And they have a local guy who does YouTube videos on learning to play ukulele. And they also have a weekly or monthly ukulele club that meets at the library. So you can play ukulele at the library.
I want that. I want that. You know, that is such a great story. Oh my gosh, I have to remember that one. I love that. You can go and borrow a ukulele and learn ukulele, and they get together and play too. I love that. That's a wonderful story, Mary. Thank you for sharing that. And you know, often institutions just have access to things that associations don't within a community, right? So let me share my screen, and I'll share some of those things with you about what they have. And so some of these things were things that you already mentioned, right? Facilities. So they have buildings and they have rooms that you can use. You know, I know book clubs or other groups that meet in local communities. They have equipment like, well, ukuleles, but you know, some places will even lend out tablets, you know, or laptops, or they have computers you can use there. There's bulletin boards and resources. There's all kinds of stuff there. Purchasing power. Sometimes you might have an institution that can buy things at cheaper prices because they buy in bulk, and then they in turn can either donate or sell at that cheaper rate directly to somebody else. So they're able to do that. Often, and institutions all have employment capacity, right? The libraries, the schools, the bank, whatever, they hire people, right? The businesses hire people. And they often are able to provide training opportunities. When I worked for the State Department of Health Services, we had an amazing computer lab in the basement of the building where I worked. I often thought, wouldn't it be so great? And we could get classes on just about any kind of technology, you know, training that we needed for our work. And I often thought, wouldn't it be great if they could offer that to community members, really open that up. Also, institutions are again made up of individual people. All those employees have individual gifts and talents and skills. They also are really connected, and they're often connected politically. You know, so the people from the school board know the people, you know, that run the town, and they're connected, or that are running the city, you know, the elected officials. So that all these things are just some of those ideas for other things they might be offering. So as we're thinking about associations and institutions, we think of them as two different tools for community problem solving. You know, they're both really important. Some people with a background in ABCD or have known about it from early on always thought that John McKnight was really negative about institutions. But what he says about institutions is he doesn't want volunteers operating on his heart. He doesn't want volunteers flying his plane when he's going somewhere. Those are really valid roles for people who are associated with institutions. But likewise, he thinks that we all realize that there's a lot of roles for people, for individuals and associations and communities that we haven't even begun to tap into, or in some cases, just invited people to participate in new and different ways. I'm going to tell you a story about that in a little bit, but I want to go through this chart just real quick as just thinking about these two differences, the differences between institutions and associations. You know, institutions really they're more formal, if you will, you know, they're more structured. You know, people, as I said before, people are paid to work for them, whereas associations, people come because they care about it, right? Institutions are more predictable. They're good at doing a lot of the same stuff for a lot of people. They usually have managers. They operate from a place of studies and data. Associations, you know, we tell stories. It's more casual. People participate because they're participants. They're citizens of their community. And I use that term in the not in the legal sense at all. We use that term in the old, Greek sense of the word, if you will, that people are citizens of the places where they live, and they both have rights and responsibilities to contribute and support their communities. But the real thing is about power. Next time we're going to get a little bit more into power, because that's where we really think about diversity and equity and inclusion. But institutions, they really operate from more of a place of control. I run a consulting organization. I'm an institution. Now, my institution is very tiny, but I'm the one that makes decisions. I don't go and poll people in my community when I decide what I'm going to do with my business, right? But associations, it's all about everybody agreeing how they're going to interact with each other. So really quick question. I'm going to stop sharing here while I ask you the question. If I'm talking about a faith community within your town or city or wherever, if I'm talking about a faith community, would you call that an association, or would you call that a local institution? Pop your answer in the chat. I'm gonna just let people do that for a minute. So a faith community, association, institution, a couple of both, institution. Institution. Could be either. So far I'm getting either and institutions. Depends on their size and their mission in the community. Interesting. Both depends. Yeah, it's a trick question, isn't it? It's a trick question. Who said it was depends or both, and would like to share why they think it's depends or both? Who would like to share why you think that answer?
I would.
Okay, Wendy, go for it.
Because I was a teacher in a religious institution for 15 years. And we have a really huge budget. We have a big school. It's one of the Lutheran schools. So we have a $1 million budget for our church and school, but we are very insular. Our belief system is that we don't get involved in heavy duty community outreach. I mean, we do, but not in the way that like the Presbyterians or, where we're just out there helping everybody who has something going on. Our mission is different than that. So that's why I'm saying, you can be as big as an institution, but it doesn't mean that's how you're going to be perceived in the community.
So, one of the things I hear you saying is that it's a huge organization, and there's a big budget, and there's a lot of structure, and there's a lot of specific roles within it that are really clearly defined and stuff like that. That totally marks it as an institution. It does not, the involvement in the community does not determine whether something is an institution or an association. You can have an association that's totally uninvolved in the community. All they do is get together and read books. That is it. All right. So, so the description you give is very much an institution. But having said that, there are faith communities that do operate more as associations. And I can give you an example. Think of Quakers. All of a sudden I had a mental block. Quakers. I have friends who belong to Quaker communities. They've got no structure. The way they describe their faith community, they have no structure, especially to their services. They show up, they sit in silence. If somebody's moved to speak, they speak. If things need to get done, somebody will step up and do it. They have very little structure. The power is very shared. It's very diffuse among the members. They don't have anybody paid to be in charge. They don't have any specific role or power. If I go back to sharing my screen, you know, what you were describing, Wendy, you know, really does fall under the institution more. Now, and, you know, when I was talking about my friend's Quaker community, it really was more of an association. People show up by consent. It's very informal. They have a little bit of structure, but not that much. So, you know, faith communities could be either or. You could also have, even within a very institutional faith community, you could have associations of people there. So for example, maybe there's a Bible study group that comes and meets once a week, and people, they do it voluntarily. There's no, you know, they organize it themselves, you know, whatever. There's a Lutheran community here on the island. There's a quilting group that meets once a week at the church, but it's all the quilting group runs themselves. They are not run by the church per se. So they are an association within this larger institution. Now, we often think about whether people, you know, whether something is an association or an institution for a couple of reasons. One is that you may approach associations differently than you approach institutions. If you have a book group, you're not going to ask them for a grant. But if you have a town or a foundation, if you will, that would be more of an institution, you would go to them for a grant. You may go to an association and say, would you like to volunteer for some of our activities that we have going on? You know, or what activities, what do you guys care about in terms of the natural environment in our community? You know, they may be a good place to check in with. So you approach them differently. And they have different kinds of assets available as well. So it's really important. And you also think about how the power is controlled within that group. You know, if you came to my book group, you better talk to the whole book group, because if you just talk to me, I'm going to say, wait, I'm going to get some of the other women together here so we can hear what you have to say. Whereas if you know, came to me, you know, if I was on the school board, I'm not, but if I was on the school board, you would approach me very differently than you would as a member of my book club. So we really want to think about things like that. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes left. And I'm going to kind of go quickly through the other three assets, not because they're not important. I really want to stress how important they are, but because I think that they may make a lot more sense to you. They're more concrete, or the first two especially are more concrete. We may spend a few minutes more on the last one. All right, we're going to talk about physical assets. So this one will really resonate with all of our friendly nature friends here. We're talking about spaces and places in our community, on the earth, under the earth even. But to remember, it's both human-made and nature-made. I have had groups totally focus on nature-made. And yes, water is definitely a physical asset. You're talking to somebody who lives on an island. Of course, water is a physical asset. Soil is a physical asset, right? The nutrients in our ground are physical assets. You know, our water table, the artesian wells, you know, these are all physical assets. And with nature-focused folks, it's really easy to think about all those nature assets. And as people who live in rural communities, we tend to identify those. I've also had groups that, boy, I had to really help them get beyond the human-made physical assets. They wanted to talk about the school building, the library building, the parks. They talked about the parks or the railroad train tracks, you know, things like that. So you really want to think about both human-made and physical-made.
Hey, Deb,
The next one. Yeah.
Can I ask you just a quick question or make a quick comment? I recognize the use of the term asset in this broader conversation. But I know, this could take 3 hours to debate or to discuss, but when we start talking about natural assets, it almost implies something we need to use that has direct benefit to humankind. And I personally have a problem with that. You know, we often talk about environmental impacts rather than environmental enhancement statements. So I understand why you're putting it in there as an asset, but in the broader environmental movement, I think we also have to recognize, what role does a cockroach play? Well, it plays a role in the web of life. You know, is it an asset or not? So that I just bring this up as the nuance when we deal with these types of assets. That's all.
Ralph, that's just great, because again, you're doing exactly what I hope that you all are doing, which is taking charge of your learning and thinking about it in your context, right? So when I talk about assets, there's two parts of that, yes. I am thinking first and foremost, I think about these as treasures, as things that we value, right? So we first and foremost think of these as things we value in our community. And yes, in terms of ABCD, we think about how can we build on the things we value. So we don't want to lose that underlying fact that we value these things. So living here on an island, you know, I value the water. I value the groundwater. I value the trees. I value I value Little Lake, which is a little lake on our island, you know, on Lake Michigan. I see all those as assets to our community. And when I talk about building on those assets, I don't talk about exploiting them or ruining them. I talk about treating them as something valued that there are ways that can contribute to our community, right? So when we invite people to come visit here, or we look at, you know, the fact that, you know, we might, you know, we think about the issues that we experience here on the island. We want to make sure we don't exploit or damage the things we value. And maybe we don't, you know, we have to name those things as assets in order to know that we can't damage them. If that makes sense.
It makes sense, and this is why I said this could be a 3 or 4 hour conversation. This is the onion. There are so many layers to it. So I absolutely understand what you're saying, but without using up too much time. There is in fact a counterpoint to that as well as a natural scientist. But I agree with what you're saying, and this could be another conversation over a couple of beers or a glass of wine.
But Rolf, let me just interject and say,
forward to it.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that asset is a human construct.
Yes, exactly.
And so, I mean, to your point exactly, I mean, the natural world is the natural world, and humans create these constructs to describe elements of that natural world.
Yes, and Jim, if I can riff, Jim and I are old buddies, so we riff off of each other. So this is where we run into so many problems, because if it doesn't have value, then we don't have to. And what Jim is saying is it's spot on. We may not have that construct of the value to us, or what, even appreciating the moonrise or a sunrise. But again, this is a deeper conversation. So I'll be quiet now. But Jim, thank you for adding that in. So important.
Well, I do agree with everything you're saying, you know, because one of the things I hear you saying too is that, you know, we talk about these physical assets, the natural physical assets. And I guess what I'm saying is that all of our physical aspects of our environment do have value, whether we recognize them or not, right? It's, you know, that it doesn't, because you're right, it's a human construct. And so is ABCD, everything we've been talking about is you know, about that, right? It's everything we've been talking about is a human construct. And I love that Department of Earth gifts is really interesting. Oh, okay, I am totally gonna put Ralph and Jim and now Bob in charge of organizing a Zoom happy hour to be talking about this. Because I think this is just great. And I'm gonna keep us moving, but let me know when that happy hour is gonna be, because I'd love to hear more about this. All right, So back to our screens. I'm going to go on the next one. The next one, oh, I went too far. Hold on a minute. Exchange and local economy. This is exchanges to recognize all the exchanges that happen within communities. And the obvious things are the businesses. And, you know, businesses exist to sell services or products. Those are the two primary things that are sold, right? Are services or products. But there's a lot of exchanges that go on that are things of value that are exchanged between people that don't involve money. So I'll give you three really great examples. Last year, I was dying for some rhubarb. My rhubarb had been eaten by all of the deer because I had just planted it the year before that, forgot to put fence around it. Deer ate all my rhubarb. We have a Facebook page. We have a couple Facebook groups, Island Rummage Sale and Island Bulletin Board. I put it out there on Island Rummage Sale, looking for rhubarb. You got any you want to get rid of? I had 6 people volunteer to give me rhubarb for nothing. All I had to do was come and chop it down, right? Come and cut it. So I got free rhubarb, and all I had to do was ask. They gave me something of value that I didn't have to pay for. Second example, it is so common here on the island, again, using our 2 Facebook groups, for someone to post, is anybody going to Sturgeon Bay or passing by Sturgeon Bay today? I need a prescription picked up at Walgreens. That happens all the time, at least once a week, and somebody always volunteers. Again, a thing of value being exchanged by people that really is not costing anybody anything extra, or nobody is having to pay for that service. It's just something of value that is shared. The third example I have is when my daughter was very young, another family I knew had a child her same age, and we each sent our babies to childcare 4 days a week, but the childcare person only offered babysitting or childcare 4 days a week. So on Fridays, they took care of my daughter. My friend did, took care of my daughter in the morning, and then at lunchtime I picked up my daughter and their daughter, and I took care of both girls in the afternoon. Okay, we were exchanging childcare services. It was kind of like an informal babysitting co-op, if you will, just for 1 day a week. And that was something of value that was happening in my community that might not have been recognized otherwise. So there's often there are these informal exchanges going on that people don't know about. The sixth one, this is the one I mentioned, was added late in the day, if you will. People began to realize as they explored and got to know communities much better with this lens of ABCD, but that boy, something was missing here. Something was just not, there was something really important missing, and realized that it was this whole asset that we call culture and stories, or sometimes you might see history, culture, and stories, that really captures the stories, the traditions, the practices, the things that bring people together. And it really represents important things to people. I like to say it's like, how do people come together in this community? How does it really bring together our sort of, again, what are those traditions or stories that bring people together? You know, here on the island, there's a lot of running jokes in this community. One of them is, and I'm surprised nobody has asked me this question yet. What do you do in the winter? That is like the biggest running joke in this community, because everyone, our answers generally are, if we told you, we'd have to kill you. Or, what do you do in the winter? What do you do in the winter? We try to beat people, like, especially if we meet people from a big city, they'll say, oh, I'm from Chicago. We'll say, what do you do in the winter in Chicago? You know, but, you know, that's like, and then there's the stories about the one time there was a bear on the island. there was one time there was a bear up here. And that's like a story that everybody on the island knows, right? But it's also like the traditions of the year. You know, we have a tradition of the Scandinavian Festival, where anybody who wants to participate starts going to Scandinavian dance practice in June, and they go for like 5 or 6 weeks. Anybody, any age goes, and they learn Scandinavian dancing. And on the first Saturday in August, it's Scandinavian Dance Fest, and there's a huge show with all the dancers in traditional Scandinavian clothing. And if you don't own any, they help you find some. Or there's loaner costumes. And I'll tell you, anybody who wants to be in it can be in it. That's an important tradition here on the island. And it's important to people regardless of what their ethnicity is or their racial makeup, or whether you are from an island, old island family, or you moved here, you know, just last summer. Anybody can be in it. And it's an amazing event. One of my favorite stories of traditions has to do with an association I mentioned earlier, and it's the quilting group. The quilting group, for years now, they have had a tradition that every year they create, I didn't mention, we have the smallest school district in the state of Wisconsin. And last year we probably had 4 graduates. So this is from K4 all the way up to high school. And we usually have, I think we have like 55 or 60 students in our whole school district. But every year for graduation, the quilting club during the year, they make quilts for each graduate. And each graduate gets a personalized quilt. I'm gonna show you a picture of this. So here's one of our graduates last year getting her quilt. And it's presented as part of graduation. And each quilt is individually designed with that student in mind. Their favorite colors, their hobbies, their family story. One guy, I remember one year, he had like they somehow found his great grandfather's blue jeans and incorporated those in there. And the students will tell you, if you ask them if they're excited about graduation, they'll say yes. The part they're most excited about is getting their quilt. And they know, and it's presented like this, and they know that no matter where they go in their lives, they always have the love and caring of the community with them. And that, every time I think about that story, it makes me get teary-eyed because I love it. It's such a beautiful, beautiful tradition in this community. So I'm gonna stop sharing here for a minute. Okay. So I know we have to wrap up, and perfect timing because I got through all the main stuff we were talking about. I'm going to ask, I don't know how many, I'm so sorry that so many people got bumped off, back on, bumped off, back on. We can all have a mutual hate for Frontier experience with them. And I'm glad that people kept coming back and trying to hang in there. We are going to have a part 2, and that one's going to be in person on the 25th in the afternoon. I got that right, Natalie? Natalie says yes, good. And what I want you guys to be thinking about, what you got today was as I said, the vocabulary lesson, or the basic nuts and bolts of what is ABCD. Now, I first learned about ABCD right after John and Jody wrote their first book in 1993. And I feel like I am still learning about it. I'm still learning about how it applies in different communities, in different contexts. I have people say, you know, there's this asset that we don't think fits into your 6 assets. I say, great, recognize it, celebrate it, figure out, you know, what you think about it, you know, hold it in your hand, roll it around, you know, talk to people about it. So there's lots of different ways to think about it. And one of the things I want to challenge you all is I know that one of the things that you are really interested in thinking about as you move forward is thinking about how does having this ABCD lens, if you will, or some of these tools, how does that really make you think about, equity and inclusion, diversity, justice? How does that, I like to think of it in terms of like, how does it help me think of my community really being a welcoming, what I would describe as a welcoming community? Does my community welcome all kinds of people? Or are there messages that are being given somehow that only certain people are welcome, or only certain individual gifts are gifts to be treasured, and that there are some groups of people whose gifts are not treasured or who aren't even welcome to be in my community sharing their gifts? So, we're going to be talking about some more specific tools next time. And I'm challenging you again to put on that thinking cap of yours and think about how it applies, in the context of DEI and justice, to think about how it applies in terms of environmental and, Lakeshore or, nature context. And I'm hoping that we'll have more time for conversation about those kind of things. With that, I'm just going to wrap up and turn it back over to Natalie.
Thank you so much, Deb, and thank you for everyone for your patience in my internet challenges today. And I heard from a few others up here in the thumb that we were having challenges as well, so I apologize. It's a windy day here on the lake, and it's affecting our internet apparently. So,
well, I'm glad that I'm glad you figured out a way, Natalie, for all of you people up in the door there to channel all of the available bandwidth so that we've got you back. That's good. Glad you commandeered it.
I drove back home, and now I have a different background.
Hey, just real quick, Natalie, can I just jump in?
Yes, please.
Well, okay, just real quickly, 3 things. One, Deb, thank you so much for joining with us and using all of your available voice for the 2 hours with us. That was very sweet of you. Glad that the tea powered you through, and maybe now it's on to some other kind of beverage that you can enjoy this evening that will power you right into tomorrow. Who knows? So thank you, Deb. This was so meaningful. And I also just want to give a thank you to Natalie from our team, who really took the lead on facilitating this. This was really something that Natalie from the outset, relative to our DEI initiatives and engagement, championed. And not just because of the relationship that she shares with Deb, but because of the value that she knew it would present to our organization and to our partners. So a huge thank you to Natalie for all of her efforts in leading this specific effort forward. Deb mentioned the training on the 25th. Everybody should note that if you're joining with us that day, we will conclude by breaking bread together. That is for me, and I know so many of you who are really date back on the LNRP model and the tradition and the people far greater than I. That is, to me, one of the most beloved traditions, is that when we gather, we break bread, and it's a way of, I'll borrow Wendy's, connective threads. I mean, that's something that's very human in all of us, and the ability to just take that time and be present with one another. And so it will be nice to conclude that day, our work together that day, by breaking bread. And to that end, I'll just close my thoughts, Deb, by saying that as an aficionado of all things rhubarb, anytime you need a guinea pig, I am happy to volunteer myself for the end product.
I love rhubarb. It's so good.
Agreed.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I'm looking forward to seeing most, if not all of you in person. And I love that tradition of breaking bread together. I love that. I'll be looking forward to joining you for that as well. And I'm going to wait to hear from Bob and Jim and Rolf about that happy hour.
Cool. I think we should all now follow Wendy's lead and try to get outside.
Yes.
That's my plan.
Thank you all.
Same
Looking
here.
forward to hearing
Thank
all
you,
of your
everybody.
collective
Thank you, everybody.
thoughts and
Thank you.
continuing
Deb,
this journey
excellent.
together.
Really, really
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deb.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.